Hey, podcast friends. This is Dr. Steve Hewlett with the podcast Simple Healthy Choices for Weight Loss, where every week we help people who have realized that as their health has been declining over the years, the number of medications they are being prescribed is increasing. We want to help you reverse this health path so you can live the vibrant, pain-free, and hopefully medication-free life you deserve to live. If you'd like even more information on this topic, you can go to Amazon or Audible and pick up my book, Your Plate is Your Fate. And if you think my book helps you on your new health path, please tell your friends and leave a review where you purchased it. Hey, podcast friends. Thank you so much for joining me for another podcast. And today, what I want to talk about, and we've kind of touched on it in some of my previous podcasts, but I want to explain to you how extremely important it is for us to move. So our nutrition is extremely important, as all my podcasts have been saying, but there's also a reason why we're supposed to move our bodies. Our bodies are made to be moved, and our body starts deteriorating if we don't move. And so on our next podcast, my wife and I will actually be talking about different types of simple movement, not exercise, just simple movements. And in this one, I want to explain one main system that is extremely important to our body for different reasons. It's good as far as it helps us as far as nutrition. It helps us as far as infections, and it also helps us as far as like edema or swelling throughout our body. And this system we're going to be talking about is the lymphatic system. And most people don't know very much about the lymphatic system, and that's why I kind of want to explain to you so my listeners will know what it is and why it's so important to move. And usually if people talk about the lymphatic system, all they know is about the lymph nodes, because they know that your doctor will palpate the lymph nodes around your neck or in your groin or anything if they're trying to assess if there's an infection. And so today I want to explain why that is. And so the main thing, when you talk about the lymphatic system, picture your blood system, your circulatory system, your cardiovascular system with your arteries and with your veins. And this is exactly what the lymphatic system also looks like, except, and if you remember back in the previous podcast that I had, I explained all about the circulatory system and how that worked and how it goes from your heart out through your aorta into your large arteries. And then those large arteries start going down to more smaller and smaller called arterioles. And then that goes down to even a smaller thing called a capillary. And the capillary bed those are only one cell thick, and that's where all the nutrients are exchanged. That's where all the oxygen is given to the tissues, all your electrolytes, all your protein, your amino acids, your fatty acids, everything that cell needs. That goes out through the capillary system, but then it comes right back in. This is a closed system. So then the fluid comes back into the venules, which is the very, very tiniest veins. And then that goes on into veins. And then that dumps into the trunk of either the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava, which goes and drops into the right side of the heart. So that's a closed system. And so the blood just keeps circulating around and around. To where the lymphatic system also has a similar thing where it's going to start off in very like capillaries. It's going to start off as capillaries, and then it's going to go into tiny lymphatic vessels. And these tiny lymphatic vessels are about the size of the arterioles, but they're not as small as the capillaries. And the biggest thing with the lymphatic system is where your blood system, your circulatory system is a closed system where the blood just keeps going around and around. The lymphatic system isn't. It actually is made up of tiny little finger-like protrusions that are flowed all around in all the different capillary beds all around inside your body. And think of this kind of like your lymphatic system is like an outer road to a major highway. So, when you're driving down the major highway, that would be like your bloodstream. Okay. And then the outer road, that's where the lymphatic system is. And it just kind of runs right along all of your arteries and your veins. And what this does is, and we'll talk about the different purposes. There's three main things that your lymphatic system does. So I'll just break it down each individually. But just so you kind of get an idea of the way it works, is your lymphatic system, like I said, it's a closed-ended, so it's not open. It's not like the capillary, or your capillary and bloodstream, your veins and arteries. So what your lymphatic system has is inside all of your capillary beds, you've got these little finger-like projections. And these finger-like projections, they have along the side of them, they have these little overlapping endothelial cells. And these overlapping cells act like little valves. And so one of the main reasons they're here for is to collect extra fluid, because as the fluid comes out of the bloodstream, out of the capillaries into the tissues to give all your tissues all the nutrients that it needs, and also take back waste, you're losing a lot of fluid. And so this fluid goes in, and it's about 20 liters a day. And of that 20 liters a day, about 17 liters get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream on the venous side. But that still leaves about 3 liters of fluid that just sitting out in your tissues. And so this fluid also needs to be returned back to the circulatory system. And that's how it does it. It does this by the lymphatic system. So you have these little finger-like projections with these little epithelial, kind of like one-way valves on the side. And when the water pressure, the fluid pressure that's in the tissues outside that lymphatic vessel, when that water pressure is high, that forces water into the lymphatic vessel. Well, as the water goes in through these one-way valves in the lymphatic vessel, when the pressure on the inside of the lymphatic vessel, when that increases as that water is going in, that puts pressure on those one-way valves and it closes them. So now you have the fluid inside the lymphatic vessel, and now that gets propelled all the way through. It goes from the capillaries, then it goes into the lymphatic vessels. And then these lymphatic vessels, they lead into lymphatic trunks. So they're bigger blood vessels. And you actually have 9 different lymphatic trunks that are throughout your body. You have 2 of them up around the jugular vein. And remember, as far as your veins, you have carotid arteries that take blood to the brain. And then you have the jugular veins that bring the blood back and puts it back into the heart. So that's the jugular vein. So you have 2 little lymphatic trunks that wrap around the jugular veins. Then you also have 2 little subclavian trunks. And those are the ones that your collarbone is called your clavicle. So right underneath your clavicle is a clavicular trunk or subclavicular trunk of your lymphatic system. And these are right next to each other. So the jugular trunk and the subclavicular trunks are right next to each other. And I'll explain why that's important in just a little bit. But then you also have 2 bronchomediastinal trunks. Then you have 2 lumbar trunks that are going to be empty in the lower part of your body. And then you have an intestinal trunk where you have a lymphatic trunk that just goes straight from the intestines straight up the heart. And then I'll explain why that is too. And what these do is these trunks, these are just going to take all the lymphatic fluid. And then these trunks actually empty into one of 2 different ducts. There's a right lymphatic duct. And this is the lymphatic duct that drains all of the right arm, the right chest, and the right side of the head. And these ducts, it empties right into where the jugular vein and the subclavian vein come together right up by your neck. And this is important because right where those 2 come together, that's right before the blood gets returned right back to the right side of your heart. So this is a place where there's the lowest pressure is right there. So that's easy for this lymphatic fluid to drop right in there. Then on the left side, you also have another big duct, and this one's called the thoracic duct. And this is where all the rest of the lymphatic fluid from all the rest of the bodies empties into that duct. And it's in the same space on the left side. It's right by the subclavicular trunk and the jugular trunk. And again, it dumps in there and it goes right across and it drops into the superior vena cava, and then that goes straight into the right atrium of the heart. And this is important because what I just said was that these lymphatic vessels pick up this extra fluid. So like I said, about 17 liters get filtered and get put back in the bloodstream, and about 3 liters stay out. But the other 3 liters that stays out, that gets reabsorbed back into this lymphatic vessels and carried back up and dumped back in the cardiovascular system. If this gets plugged and this doesn't work, that's where you start getting swelling, like swelling in your ankles, swelling in different areas. If something happens to your lymphatic system, this gets blocked. So that's one of the big things that you have to do, or how this is very good as far as the circulatory system, is to be able to put all this fluid back into the system. Now, the second thing that the lymphatic system does is one of its biggest things is the immune system. The lymphatic system is major important for our lymphatics, for our immune system. And like I said, these have these little finger-like projections that are in all these capillary beds with these little one-way valves that I was just talking about. These valves are fairly large. So a lot of things that won't actually fit into the blood go across the capillary bed into the bloodstream. They will get into the plasma or into the lymphatic system. And this is why this is important to have these here. So any debris that's in the tissues for whatever reason, from a trauma or anything, if you have debris in a tissue, if you have bacteria or viruses or cancer cells, if you have anything like that in the tissues, these things will actually be taken into the lymphatic system. And the reason this is important is because while this fluid is going through the lymphatic system, there's actually stops along the way. And these stops are called lymph nodes. And like I said, you may have know about this because this is what the doctor is going to palpate, around your neck, around your clavicle, down your groin, in your armpits. These are some of the major places where you have your palpable lymph nodes. And your doctor's feeling for those to see if those are swollen. Well, the reason these may be swollen is because these lymph nodes, you have about 800 lymph nodes all throughout your body. And these go anywhere from a few millimeters in size to 1 to 2 centimeters in size. And like I said, there's some that are palpable, like in your neck, armpit, and groin, but there's also a lot of them all along your abdomen and all along your intestines. And what these nodules do is as these bacteria and viruses and debris and everything that's coming into these little finger-like projections in the capillary system, it gets into the lymphatic system, it starts going, it comes into a lymph node. And think of the lymph node as like a little ball that has cotton inside of it. And this cotton is actually, they're little collagen fibers, but this cotton acts like a filter. So all the bacteria and viruses and debris that come through that node, it gets caught up in that cotton and that filter. Well, once it's caught in the filter, there are cells inside this lymph node called dendritic cells. And what these dendritic cells do is they go over and they eat whatever the product, whatever this thing is that's caught in the cotton and this filter and this collagenous filter that's in the nodule or in the lymph node. And the dendrite will actually eat that, and then it breaks it up into parts, and then it presents it on the outside of its cell. It just kind of eats it, tears it into pieces, and puts it like in its hands and says, okay, here's what we've got. What that does, that causes the B cells. There's 2 different lymph cells. There's B cells and T cells. The B cells, the B lymphocytes, what they do is they'll go over and they'll look at what this dendrite is presenting on the outside, saying what this foreign particle is. If the B cell looks at it and notices that it is a foreign particle, the B cell will turn into a plasma cell and just start popping out a bunch of antibodies. And what the antibodies do is the antibodies are specific to that antigen, which is part of the cancer cell or part of the virus or part of the bacteria. It's some part of that, and it produces antibodies that recognizes that. Once these antibodies are produced, all these antibodies, they go out and they get put into the bloodstream along with your T cells. So now you have T cells that are floating around also, and they go between your bloodstream and your lymph system all the time. And these T cells know what these antibodies are. And so they're waiting. These antibodies will find these foreign particles floating in your blood or in your tissue, and they'll attach to it. That makes the T cell see it, and they'll go over and know that it's not supposed to be there, and it eats it up and gets rid of it. Okay. That's how we keep infection down, is because our B cells are producing antibodies. Those attach to the antigen of whatever the offending organism is, and our T cells will recognize that and eat it. And this is so important that this system works very, very well. And you'll know, because if you've got an infection, there's going to be a lot of bacteria, viruses are going through that lymph node. So a lot of them are getting caught. So there's a lot of white blood cell and lymphocyte production that's going on inside that lymph node. And so that lymph node will swell. And that's when you'll feel it. And sometimes it gets painful. So if you have a painful lymph node, that's just a lymph node that's sitting there and it's working really hard. That just means that you have an infection somewhere in that part of your body, and it's draining into that lymph node. Now, one thing is sometimes cancer cells can get caught in this cotton mesh, and it'll sit there and replicate. And it actually takes over the lymph node, and it just makes a bunch of very hard little cells. So if you touch a lymph node and it's big and it's hard, but there's no pain with it, you definitely need to get that checked out, because it could be a sign of cancer. So just something to think about. So that's the other thing. So we've talked about how the lymphatic system works for the circulatory system, as far as putting the excess fluid back into the bloodstream. And we've talked about the immune system. Now, also part of this immune system of the T cells, you also have lymphoid tissue. That's all part of the lymphoid system also. And this is first you have your primary lymphoid glands like bone marrow, tonsils, and thymus. And the bone marrow, these are the sites that actually produce all these lymphocytes. And then they help them distinguish between what cells are body cells and what cells are non-body cells, a foreign particle that got into our bloodstream that's not supposed to be there. So it learns all that stuff here. And in the tonsils, you think of tonsils in the back of the mouth, but really you've got tonsils, all the way around, right where your tongue goes down to the back of your throat. You have tonsils all around there. You have tubal tonsils, which are kind of right back on the throat. You have palatine tonsils, which are the ones that you usually think of that get swollen. And then you have lingual tonsils that are just right down underneath the base of the tongue. And then you have pharyngeal tonsils, which are also called adenoids. And all those tonsils are part of the lymphatic system. And the reason they line that whole area is because they're inspecting all the food that we're eating and all the air that we're inhaling, and making sure that there's no bad things that are getting ready to get in our system that it's going to have to take care of. So that's why the lymphatic system is so important. Now, the thymus is something you may not know. The thymus is a little organ that kind of sits right on the top of the heart, kind of right by where the aorta comes out. And it's really only present more in the neonatal period, so like the first month of life, pretty much all the way up until like prepubal area. And then after that, you don't have the thymus anymore, because now the bones are grown so big that you have enough bone marrow to be able to produce all the lymphocytes that you need. So that thymus, after about puberty area, right about puberty, that thymus will just kind of shrink and become just a little fatty nodule on top of your heart. But anyway, so that's what the lymphoid organs are. That's why. And the other one is the spleen. We also have the spleen, which is an extremely large organ also. And that also helps filters out the bad red blood cells, anything that are dead. And it filters out a lot of these lymphocytes that have been coming through there. Now, the last one is nutrition, which is very odd to think about. But your lymphatic system also, like we said, you've got nodules all up and down your intestines also. And actually in your intestines have a bunch of little wrinkles all over it, because that increases its absorptive area. And inside each one of these little wrinkles, there's going to be part of this lymphatic system. And they're actually called Peyer's patches. And these are like little lymph nodes that are up inside each of the little wrinkles inside the intestines. The reason these are here, if you listen to my podcast number 7 on things to look for when having a lipid panel done, I explained all about what low density lipoproteins are, very low density lipoproteins, high density lipoproteins, and triglycerides and all that. Well, if you remember my past podcast, when you eat carbohydrates or when you eat protein, the amino acids and the glucose get shunted from the intestine straight over to the liver. Okay. Fat does not do that. Okay. You can't just put fat straight into the bloodstream, because fat and water don't mix, and the bloodstream is mainly water. So what you have to do is inside the intestines, they make what's actually, we talked about low density lipoproteins and very low density lipoproteins. The intestines makes what's really considered an ultra low density lipoprotein, and it's called a chylomicron. And it's ultra low density, remember, because it has a ton of triglycerides. So that's the major. Anytime you eat fat, our intestines break that into triglycerides, and then it puts it together just like the liver did with the LDLs and VLDLs. It puts it together with a protein and it has a ton of triglycerides. So that makes it an ultra low density lipoprotein. And so that's what happens. It takes these chylomicrons, and then again, the chylomicrons are really big, so they can't get into the bloodstream. So these chylomicrons go into your lymphatic system that lines your intestines, and that goes all the way up the intestinal trunk, and then it empties into the right atrium of the heart. And that's how we can get fat straight into our heart, straight from our intestines. Straight into our bloodstream from our intestines. It doesn't have to go to the liver. And then the fat can be circulated around our body for all the different multiple places it's needed, because it's needed for the cell membrane of every single cell in our body uses fat, uses cholesterol. It uses a lot of our hormones are also made. A lot of our like sex hormones are also made from cholesterol. And so anyway, that's why we need fat. And then obviously fat goes into our subcutaneous fat cells. And that's what we are supposed to use for our energy when we're not eating, except for, as most of these podcasts talk about, very seldom are we not eating. But so that's how it plays a part in nutrition. So I told you at the beginning that the lymph system is important for the circulatory system, because it pulls the excess fluid out of the tissues and puts it back in the bloodstream, so it decreases edema. It's good for our immune system because it filters out all of the bacteria, viruses, cancer, debris, tissue debris, all that kind of stuff. And it sets up antibodies and white blood cells so we can actually fight that and get rid of that. And then we talked about the nutrition, okay, why these lymphatic systems goes into your intestines, and that's actually how we get our fat absorbed into our bloodstream. The main thing that I want you to know, another thing I want you to know about this is we talked about the lymphatic fluid getting into the lymphatic system and then propelling. It only propels one way, okay? And that's because just like in the venous system, in the veins, remember the pressure is very low. In the arteries, the pressure's high because you have the heart sitting there pumping. So you have high pressure in the arteries. But as that goes down the capillaries and all the fluids leaving the capillaries, and then it gets absorbed back in the capillaries, the side on the venous side is a very low pressure. And so the way the blood gets back to the heart through the veins is, like I said, it goes back through a lot of one-way valves. So as the heart pumps, the blood will go up through the one-way valve, and then it won't go back because the one-way valve will shut off. And that's why it's so important to move, because that also helps pump the blood in our veins. That's what helps it get up to our blood. That's why if you have surgery or something like this and you're sitting down there, if you're laying down and you're not going to be able to move, that's why they put compression stockings and stuff on your legs, so you can sit there and you can pump the blood and get that blood back up to your heart, since you're not actually moving and helping it. Well, this is the exact same way that the lymphatic system is, because it also has no pump. So the only way that you can move the lymphatic system through the system and get it all the way back up to the blood where it's supposed to be, finally ending up, the only way that happens is when you move. You don't have to do anything strenuous, but you've got to move, because there's no pump for the lymphatic system. They have the endothelial layer has a little bit of contractile tissue in it where it can contract a little bit to help propel the fluid through the lymphatic system. But it's mainly done by the arteries that is right next to, as the arteries pump, that kind of pushes on the lymphatic arteries or lymphatic vessels, and then us moving our body. So our muscles in our legs, our muscles in our arms, as those move and contract, that also helps pump the lymphatic fluid. So the problem is, most of us sit most of the time. We get up in the morning, we sit while we have breakfast, and we sit in the car. Then we go to an office, we sit in an office, we get back in the car, we sit in the car all the way home. Then we either go out to dinner or we sit at home and have dinner. And then we sit in front of the television until we go to bed. And finally we quit sitting, we lay down instead. And all this time, our bodies just don't move anywhere like we used to use our bodies when we walked everywhere. And that's why you don't have to do a strenuous exercise at first if you're not used to exercising. And we'll talk about this in future podcasts, but you do need to move. You need to get up and move. If you could get up and move at least every hour, just get up and walk around if you're doing something, and it's going to help move your lymphatic fluid through. If you just sit and you don't move, that means all these toxins, all these bacteria and viruses that the lymphatic fluid has in it that it's trying to get rid of, if you don't move, it just sends stagnant. And now now these bacteria and these viruses can actually start replicating and actually cause more damage. So that's the main thing that I wanted you to do, because you've got to exercise, you've got to move. And without a doubt, the best exercise you could ever do is the one that you will do. So it doesn't really matter at this stage of the game, when you're just trying to get healthy, you're trying to become not so obese, and this is not the time to start exercising. I'll talk about that later, but it's definitely a time that you've got to move, even if you just get out there and walk. So I hope this made sense. I wanted you to understand when you hear about the lymphatic system, because it's an extremely important system that we just don't talk about that much. And what I really want you to get is you've got to move. There's so many good benefits to just moving, and your lymphatic system is just one of them. So I'll end it right there for today. And again, just like always, if you have any questions, please contact us on one of our social media sites, and I'll do a podcast for that if you'd like. So once again, thank you so much for listening, and have a great week. And remember, make simple, healthy choices to live a quality life. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button below, and be sure to tell someone else who may want to change their health path as well. And don't forget, you can also purchase my book, Your Plate is Your Fate, on Amazon or Audible. And if you do, please leave a review.